Good evening. We are learning Parshat Emor. We're using Art Scroll Chumash on page 673. Parshat Emor has 64 commandments in it. 24 positive commandments and 40 negative commandments. So it contains a lot of information, and we will try to mention and explain each one as much as possible. Now, just like the whole book is called in English Leviticus, which means it's instructions for Levites, so too this particular parsha is specifically focused on the tribe of Levi, and specifically for the subcategory of Levi, what we call Kohanim, Kohen. It will speak about a lot of commandments that apply only to Kohanim, as well as limitations, together with the responsibility and the high status. Kohanim have more mitzvot, also come more limitations. Now, okay, let's start the parsha. Let me mute everyone. Okay, page 673. Hashem said to Moshe, "Say to the Kohanim, the sons of Aharon." Aharon is a Levite, but he later was promoted to become a Kohen, and his children and his grandchildren and everyone after that are also Kohanim. They are Leviim as well, but they are on a higher level. They are Kohanim. And tell them, each of you shall not contaminate himself to a dead person among his people. Here we learn the first law for Kohanim, and that is that they are not allowed to contaminate themselves with a dead body. And the verse says, among his people. As long as the deceased is among the Jewish people, which means there are people who can take care of him, the Kohen is not allowed to touch. However, if the dead body is in the field or in a place where no one else can take care of him, then Kohen is allowed to contaminate himself, and the Kohen is obligated to bury the dead body. Verse 2. Some exceptions. Who the Kohen is allowed to come into contact with, except for the relative who is closest to him. And here we list 7 relatives that a Kohen is allowed to participate in their burial. His mother and his father, his son and his daughter, his brother and his sister who is not married to a man, a single sister. These are 6 people plus the Kohen's wife. These people, if God forbid they die, the Kohen is allowed to be present at the cemetery and actually come into contact with them. Verse 4 explains that even though we said that a wife is one of the close relatives that the Kohen is allowed to come into contact with if she dies, however, a husband among his people shall not contaminate himself to one who desecrates him. If a Kohen married a wife that is forbidden to him, then he is not allowed to participate in her burial if she dies. For example, a Kohen is not allowed to marry a woman who was previously divorced. And if he does, the marriage is blemished. The child from such a marriage is not a Kohen. He is called a Halal. And if this wife dies, the Kohen is not allowed to participate in the burial. Now, verse 5. They shall not make a bald spot on their heads. There's a similar prohibition for any Jew. If a relative dies and out of anguish and sorrow you want to hurt yourself, you're not allowed. That was the custom of the non-Jews, idol worshippers, that they would maim themselves to show their feelings toward their lost loved one. But the Jewish people are not allowed, because we believe that death is not the end. We're not losing our loved ones forever. We will be reunited with them soon. And in fact, they are still alive. They still exist and they can still see us. And we should not show uncontrolled grief. So that's number one. Number two, they shall not shave the edge of their beard. That also applies to everyone else, all the other Jews, that we're not allowed to shave with a razor our face. And number three, in their flesh they shall not cut a gash. Again, this was a custom of non-Jews, that if someone died, they would cut themselves. We are not allowed to do it. Why? Verse 6 explains, they shall be holy to their God. They should recognize God created them. God put the soul in the body. God takes the soul out of the body. The body goes back to the earth. There is nothing to be angry about, nothing to mourn deeply. In fact, the connection between the soul and the body is holy. The body is holy while the soul is in it. When the soul leaves, the body becomes contaminated, because it's the soul that gives the body significance. It's the soul that makes the body a human being. And therefore, when the soul leaves, we don't feel bad for the body. And that is one of the reasons that we have to bury the body as soon as possible. Not to confuse anybody, that they might think that this is the person, this is the human being. And that is also why we don't put a picture of the deceased on the tombstone, because we don't want to confuse anybody that this image of the body was the human being. It was just the body. It's compared to the rider and the horse. The body represents the horse. The soul represents the rider on it. And therefore, we cannot desecrate our own body that is holy, because we have a soul, for a body that doesn't have a soul. Now, verse 7, some marriage restrictions for Kohanim. They shall not marry a woman who is a harlot. Harlot means a woman who had relations with someone who is forbidden to her. For example, a non-Jew, or a mamzer, or a a relative or anyone else that she's not allowed to have relations with. Another definition of a harlot is a woman who gets married to multiple people, which means not married but has relations indiscriminately with many men. Even if they're all Jewish and they're all kosher, but because she's not committed to any one of them, that makes her a harlot, and she is not allowed to marry a Kohen. And he is not allowed to marry a desecrated woman, which in Hebrew is called halala. That means a daughter of a Kohen that was born from a marriage that was invalid. For example, if Kohen married a harlot, their children are halalim. If Kohen married another halala, a woman that was born from an invalid marriage, or if a Kohen married a divorced woman, that is number 3. They shall not marry a woman who has been divorced by her husband. And again, if a Kohen marries a woman that has been divorced before, his children are no longer Kohanim, because they are holy to their God. By selecting the Kohanim to serve God, Hashem elevated them, and with their higher status, he gave them more responsibility and he gave them more limitations. Now, page 675, how should we treat Kohanim? You shall sanctify him, for he offers the food of your God. He shall remain holy to you, for I am holy, Hashem, who sanctifies you. We have an obligation to sanctify Kohanim. What does it mean to sanctify Kohanim? That means we have to give them preferential treatment. For example, if there is an opportunity to do a mitzvah and only one person can do it, we give that honor to a Kohen. For example, someone needs to lead us in Birkat Hamazon, in the grace after meal, we give Kohen that right. He becomes the leader. Who is the first one to read the Torah? We give that privilege to Kohen. And so too in other mitzvot. And another meaning of you shall sanctify him is a commanded for the Jewish community, that even if the Kohen doesn't want to be a Kohen and doesn't behave like a Kohen, it's our obligation to convince him and to force him to behave as a Kohen should. And verse 9, what if a Kohen's child misbehaves? If the daughter of a Kohen will be desecrated through adultery, she desecrates her father. She shall be consumed by the fire. That means that although any woman is not allowed to commit adultery, a daughter of Kohen receives a more severe punishment, because not only she desecrates herself, but she also desecrates the group of people who are servants of God. And therefore, unlike other people who committed adultery, they also get death penalty, but by strangulation, she gets a more severe kind of death penalty that's called death by fire, which is not burning in fire like the non-Jews do, but rather it is pouring molten lead down the person's throat, which is an instant death, and it is painless. Verse 10, laws of Kohen Gadol. Until now we spoke about regular Kohanim. The Kohen who is exalted above his brothers. Kohen Gadol means the great Kohen, upon whose head the anointment oil has been poured. or who has been inaugurated to don the vestments. There are two ways for a Kohen to become Kohen Gadol. One is if they pour special anointment oil on his head and smear it certain shape. Or another way is to wear the 8 garments that Kohen Gadol wears, as opposed to 4 garments that a regular Kohen wears. And we need these two methods because there was a time in Jewish history when the anointment oil was hidden before the destruction of the first temple, and for the remainder of the first temple and for the entirety of the second temple, Kohen could only become Kohen Gadol by wearing the 8 garments, no longer by oil. So, some more laws about Kohen Gadol. He shall not leave his head unshorn, means he must cut his hair at least once a month. He may not allow 30 days to pass without taking a haircut. And the Mishnah says that actually the Kohen Gadol would not extend it so much. The Kohen Gadol would take haircut once a week. The regular Kohen would take a haircut once a month. And the Jewish king would take a haircut once a day, every day. And the Kohen Gadol may not rend his garments. This is the commandment for any garment of a Kohen, that we're not allowed to tear garments of a Kohen. Or specifically for Kohen Gadol, he must keep himself well groomed because he represents the entire nation. His hair must be done freshly, and his garments must be fitting and clean and in order, not torn. Now, verse 11. Kohen Gadol has more strict laws about contact with the dead. He shall not come near any dead person. He shall not contaminate himself to his father and his mother. Even close relatives, the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to bury, unless there is no one else to take care of them. If Kohen Gadol is walking outside of the city and he sees a corpse and there's no one around to help, he must quickly bury the corpse, even though he will become contaminated. And in verse 12 we learn that if a close relative of Kohen Gadol dies, such a person is called onen. Before the deceased is buried, the mourner is not allowed to do any mitzvot because he must participate in the burial. So all other mitzvot are put on hold, and we tell him, go take care of your deceased. However, since Kohen Gadol doesn't have to or is not allowed to participate in the burial of even close relatives, therefore there's nothing for him to do, and therefore his status of onen is different from other Jews, and he is allowed to continue serving in Beit HaMikdash. Verse 13, additional restrictions for marriage for Kohen Gadol. He shall marry a woman in her virginity. A regular Kohen does not have to marry a woman who is a virgin. For example, a regular Kohen is allowed to marry a woman who was married but her husband died. A regular Kohen is allowed to marry an almana, a widow. Regular Kohen is just not allowed to marry a divorcee, a divorced woman. Kohen Gadol, in addition to what verse 14 says, a widow, a divorcee, and a desecrated woman and a harlot, he shall not marry these. In addition to them, Kohen Gadol cannot marry any woman who had any relations with any other man. Only a virgin of his people shall he take as a wife. Verse 16. Kohanim, since they serve Hashem in Beit HaMikdash, they must look presentable, not only in their outwardly appearance with their hair, their clothing, but they also have to be complete in their limbs. If a Kohen has any blemish, any visible blemish on his body, he's not allowed to serve in Beit HaMikdash. And the next paragraph lists these blemishes. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to Aaron saying, any man of your offspring in whom there will be a blemish shall not come near to offer the food for Hashem. Food of Hashem refers to korbanot, the offerings. For any man in whom there is a blemish shall not approach. For example, a blind person, a lame Kohen, meaning he is limping, whose nose has no bridge, which means this part doesn't exist. If you go from one eye to another, you will be able to go straight without the nose bridge. That is considered a blemish. Or who has one limb longer than the other. If one hand is longer, or his foot is longer, and so on. Or he has a broken leg or a broken arm until they're healed properly, not crookedly. He is not allowed to serve. Or he who has abnormally long eyebrows. They go and hang over his eyes. Or he's a hunchback. Or he has a membrane on his eye, like a cataract. Or he's a dwarf. Or he has dry skin eruption or moist skin eruption. And the final one, if he has crushed testicles. Now we turn to page 677. Even though they're not allowed to serve in Beit HaMikdash, however, verse 22 says that they still remain Kohanim and they are allowed to eat offerings. The food of his God from the most holy and from the regular holy may he eat. But he shall not come to the curtain, and he shall not approach the altar. He is not allowed to serve. Now, chapter 22, some laws of impurity. What if a Kohen becomes impure? Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to Aaron and his children that they should withdraw from the holies of the children of Israel, so as not to desecrate my holy name. What does it mean? They should distance themselves in two ways. Number one, if a Kohen becomes impure, tameh, he's not allowed to bring offerings for the Jewish people. He should distance himself. And he's not allowed to eat the offerings. Say to them, verse 3, throughout your generations, any man from among any of your offspring who shall come near the holies, with his contamination upon him, he shall be cut off from before me. There is a severe punishment for Kohen who serves in Beit HaMikdash while being contaminated, and he receives heavenly death, means early death. What are examples of impurity? Verse 4, any man from the offspring of Aaron who is a metzorah. Metzorah is impure. Person who has tzarat. Or a zav, person who has unusual emission, shall not come to eat from the holies until he becomes purified. And one who touches anyone contaminated by a corpse, that's a third kind of impurity. Or a man from whom there is a seminal emission. That's the fourth kind of impurity. And the fifth kind is a man who touches any swarming thing through which he can become contaminated, which means a person who touches or carries flesh of an animal that died without shechita, without ritual slaughter, such an animal is contaminated, and a person who touches or carries it is also contaminated. Verse 6, the person who touches it shall be contaminated until the evening. He shall not eat from the holies until he has immersed his body in the water. Now we turn to page 679. Verse 10, we learn about teruma. Teruma is a portion that we separate from our produce, and we give it to Kohen. According to Torah, there is no minimum, but the rabbis set the minimum at 2%, 1 out of 50. No layman shall eat of the holy. Layman here refers to anyone who is not a Kohen. And the holy refers to teruma. When we separate teruma, whether from wheat or barley, or we separate challah from our dough, challah is also called teruma, only Kohen is allowed to eat it. Or verse 11 says, if a Kohen shall acquire a person an acquisition of his money, he may eat of it. If a Kohen buys a non-Jewish slave, that slave becomes the property of Kohen, and therefore he is allowed to eat teruma. However, one who resides with the Kohen or his laborer, which means a temporary worker or a Jewish slave, shall not eat of the teruma. Verse 12, if a Kohen's daughter shall be married to a non-Kohen, she may no longer eat teruma. However, if she becomes a widow or divorced, and she still doesn't have children, she comes back to her father's home, who is a Kohen, and she can again eat teruma. Now, what happens in verse 14 if a non-Kohen by mistake eats teruma? It's a prohibition, and also he is eating something that belongs to Kohen. If a man will eat teruma inadvertently, he shall add a fifth to it and shall repay the holy to the Kohen. So let's say he ate $10 worth of teruma, he has to give to Kohen the $10 plus add enough money that together it should have 5 parts. That means we divide the $10 into 4 parts, and he gives 1/4, and together he returns $12.50, which make it 5 times 2.5, which is the quarter of 10. So even though the Torah says add a fifth, it means the fifth that he's adding, and altogether it's going to be 5 quarters. So there is a fine for someone who eats teruma to add 25% more. Now, verse 15, they shall not desecrate the holies of the children of Israel, and they will cause themselves to bear the sin of guilt when they eat their holies. Which means a Kohen who eats teruma while impure is also transgresses. Not only teruma may only be eaten by a Kohen, but the Kohen has to be pure. From here we also learn that there is a prohibition to eat the produce before you separate teruma. This produce is called tevel. Tevel means untithed produce, and there is a prohibition to eat